Good afternoon, everybody. I will start at this stage. Um, Welcome to the webinar today, and thank you very much again for the invitation to do it. The first one I did and the last one I did for you was on the 23rd of March. So I don't think I would possibly have envisaged back on the 23rd of March what the next 4 months would look like, but here we are. So what I want to do is just take you through an update on where the world economy is, what's happened since, and I suppose more importantly, talk about the prospects for recovery and what that might look like. So there's going to be a strong international focus, but towards the end then I will delve down a little bit. I'll get a little bit parochial and look into what's happening here in Ireland. I'd be delighted to take any questions. If you want to type them in as I go through, I'd be delighted to take them towards the end. Or alternatively, I would be quite happy if you could, when you want to ask a question, just I will invite you to unmute and you can ask the question. So whatever your choice is, if you have any questions. I hope the sound is okay, that I'm coming across properly. If somebody would just maybe let me know that everything is okay, or I suppose more importantly, let me know if everything is not okay.
Yeah, everything seems perfect, Jim. I can hear you clearly.
Great, and thank you very much indeed. Appreciate that. Okay, looking back on the last 4 months, it goes without saying that COVID-19 has been an absolutely massive shock to the global economy. For fuck's sake. Is everything okay there? Okay, I'm just admitting a few people here. Okay, COVID-19, as I say, has been an absolutely massive shock to the global economy. Since from the middle of March onwards, we saw large swathes of the global economy being shut down. The impact on global health has been pretty catastrophic. The impact on economic activity has been pretty catastrophic. And of course, there's this broader sort of social impact, the very negative impact it has had on people's well-being, the impact it has had on jobs. And, I definitely believe that one of the consequences of this whole issue will be that the inequality, global inequality, will definitely be exacerbated by this crisis, because, and I'll talk more about this as I go through, but it is becoming particularly clear, that certain socioeconomic groups have been affected much more adversely by this crisis than others. And indeed, certain countries have been hit disproportionately by this crisis than others. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of the sectors that have been really damaged by COVID-19 have been in the sort of accommodation, hospitality, tourism type areas where pay levels are typically lower. So there's been a huge impact there, and re-employing a lot of those people who have left, will be very, very difficult. So whereas at the other extreme, then we've people, in financial services, in professional services, in the IT industry, etc., have continued to do well during this crisis. So I think that is definitely going to be a big challenge about addressing the already serious problem of global inequality, which will be exacerbated by this. We've seen, and I'll show you some slides to demonstrate what I'm talking about, but we've seen an absolutely dramatic decline in economic activity everywhere. The International Monetary Fund has described it as the sharpest economic slowdown since the 1920s. The OECD in more recent days described it as a global health crisis without precedent. And I suppose most tellingly, the OECD said that the economic outlook is exceptionally uncertain. And that definitely goes without saying, because in a normal economic crisis, you know, you can, for example, 2007, 2008, we had the subprime crisis erupting from the United States. That then percolated through the global economy. We saw banking systems get into serious difficulty. We saw unemployment rising very, very strongly, and so on. But it was kind of clear at that stage, you know, what needed to be done. Banking systems needed to be rescued. We needed to get the banking systems back up and running, you know, so there were certain policies that were required. And you could certainly say in hindsight that the path to recovery was reasonably difficult, but still reasonably straightforward. Whereas this time round, there is this massive element of uncertainty due to the fact that how we come out of this will be determined by health issues rather than by normal economic fundamentals. So, you know, you'd have to think that until a vaccine is actually delivered, policymakers will walk a tightrope. And what we've seen happen over the last couple of months to varying degrees in different countries, and I think Ireland really was late to the party in a sense that there's been a massive debate about the health of the nation and the health of the economy. And for policymakers, that has been an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk because obviously COVID-19 has had a huge impact on the health of populations. But on the other hand, you know, when you shut down an economy, there is a limit to how long an economy can be shut down for, because at the end of the day, economic activity generates the resources that fund everything else in society, you know, health services, etc. So while the health of the nation is really important, the health of the economy is also very, very important. And that's the challenge policymakers are facing at the moment, you know, how to open up economies in a safe way. And of course, it is going to be a difficult process. And we've seen around the world to varying degrees, but particularly in the United States at the moment, we're seeing a massive resurgence of COVID-19 cases again. In recent weeks, we've seen a region in the north of Greece, North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, northern Germany, parts of Beijing, you know, so around the world, we've seen fresh outbreaks of the virus, and policymakers have stepped in and they've tried to lock down the specific area or the specific area of activity where the virus outbreak was happening. And indeed, in the last week, we've seen, you know, parts of Leicester in the United Kingdom being shut down for these reasons. And unfortunately, you know, that is going to be the way of things until a vaccine is developed or until COVID-19 becomes a treatable disease. And the whole development in the area of antibodies and all that will be important in that regard. But until people feel safe to get out there and conduct life again, until the medical people and the scientists develop some way of dealing with the virus, you know, policymaking, it will be a challenge. And as I say, I stress again, this challenge is between preserving the health of the nation and preserving the health of the economy. Economists, as you know, are always being criticized for having way too much focus on economy and business and not enough focus on society. And I think that sort of stereotype thing has been highlighted very strongly over the last few years in various countries as this balance between, you know, opening up economies while at the same time trying to preserve safety and the health of the nation. So it's challenging, and I am loath to criticize policymakers in any country for what they are doing or not doing, because nobody knows the correct answer to this one. So there's a lot of sort of trial and error. There are key differences in this economic recession from 2007, 2008. What we've seen over the last 3 or 4 months has been an absolutely aggressive, strong, coordinated official policy response to this crisis. And I'll talk you through some of that in a second. Back in 2007, 2008, as we tried to emerge from that recession, the same sort of strong coordinated response was not seen. So for example, after 2007, 2008, the US authorities reacted very, very aggressively. They cut interest rates, they implemented quantitative easing, they addressed the problems in the banking system. Whereas in Europe, in contrast, there was a very slow response, there was a very patchy response. And really, it took a couple of years before the Europeans got their act together. Whereas this time around, thankfully, globally, there's been a really, really strong coordinated response. Second thing that does differentiate this from 7-8 in a positive way is that the global financial system is still functioning, because the problem back in 2007, 2008 was that basically the global banking system, the global financial system just froze, and that then turned into a really, really difficult recession. Thankfully, to date, that has not happened, and it is a priority, in my view, that policymakers everywhere make sure that this health crisis, which has evolved into an economic crisis, is not allowed evolve into a banking crisis, because if that is allowed happen, we are then in serious difficulty. So that's why it is incredibly important, in my view, that businesses and households are supported to the greatest extent possible to prevent a bad debt situation from arising, which would then in turn feed into the health of the global banking system. Moving on, if I can, come on, slide. Okay, looking at the strong global response, I just give some examples here of what's happened. We've seen massive bond buying or quantitative easing by central banks. And there a few weeks back, for example, the European Central Bank added an extra 600 billion euros to its pandemic emergency bond buying program. So this year, or well, up to June 21, the European Central Bank at least is going to step in and buy bonds to the tune of about 1.35 trillion euro. And that's absolutely colossal stuff, coming on top of the quantitative easing program that was already in place. This is new stuff that is being designed to address the COVID-19 crisis. And one of the, for those of you who endured me in class late last year, I spoke about quantitative easing and what quantitative easing was all about. And just to remind you that what quantitative easing involves is basically central banks stepping in, buying bonds, mainly government bonds, but also corporate bonds. And the reason why they now need to step in and buy those bonds is to push long-term interest rates down, or in other words, to push government bond yields down. Because if you can keep government bond yields low, it means that governments will be able to borrow cheaply to fund what they will need to fund aggressively over the coming months to get their economies back on track. So that is the real purpose of quantitative easing at this juncture. It's to keep long-term interest rates down. It is to enable governments borrow cheaply to fund the rescue of their economies. And indeed, here in Ireland, we've seen over the last couple of months, the Irish government borrowing up to 10 years at rates slightly above 0.2, 0.3%, that sort of range. So without quantitative easing, and the European Central Bank's intervention, I suspect the Irish government would probably be paying 3-4% on its borrowings at the moment. So that's why QE, quantitative easing, bond buying is really important. We've seen up to the end of May 144 interest rate cuts around the world. That's pretty dramatic stuff, and it just shows you the extent to which central banks everywhere are getting in on the act. We've seen significant fiscal expansion, and fiscal policy, I remind you, is the use of taxation and spending by government to influence an economy. And we've seen a massive fiscal policy response around the world. And it entails three different approaches. One is direct fiscal expenditure packages. So in other words, governments are stepping in and they are spending money. So here in Ireland, for example, there's been this pandemic unemployment payment. So everybody who lost their jobs were getting in excess of €350 per week. And there was another expenditure scheme whereby the government was directly subsidizing employers who kept on their workers during the crisis. In the United States, most households have received checks for $2,000 or $3,000 to try and stimulate economic spending. So they're just examples of fiscal expenditure packages. A second part of the fiscal approach has been deferring tax payments. So the revenue authorities in many countries have given people leeway on, it has allowed people to defer tax payments, be it employment taxes, VAT, whatever, corporation tax. And indeed in this country, the payment of property tax, which was due in March, was pushed out to the middle of July. So we've seen the deferral of tax payments. The hope of authorities is that all of that tax will eventually end up being paid, but it's deferred for the moment, which from a cash flow perspective is important. A third part of the fiscal approach is to provide liquidity to banks and to guarantee bank lending, because one of the issues is that, you know, during an economic crisis, bank lending becomes riskier, and bank lending to small and medium enterprises becomes particularly risky. So if left to their own devices, banks will be very reluctant, and sensibly so, to lend money to businesses that are high risk. But that's where government needs to step in and provide guarantees on that lending, you know, to encourage the banks to lend money to companies that may be risky and vulnerable. I think that's absolutely essential. Those are the key elements of the fiscal response. In normal circumstances, those sorts of fiscal responses would not be possible for a couple of reasons. One is EU state aid rules prevent, you know, governments from lending financial support to businesses, to sectors, because of competition rules. Those state aid rules have basically been set aside during this unprecedented crisis. The second thing that happened was that in the European Union, there are restrictions on, in normal circumstances, there are restrictions on member countries of the European Union as to how the level of budget deficit that they can run, the level of government debt that they should have. So in other words, those fiscal rules in normal circumstances prohibit governments from borrowing too much, and there was a limit of budget deficit could not exceed 3% of GDP during an economic downturn. Obviously, with this unprecedented shock, it was really necessary for governments to step in and throw the kitchen sink at the problem and borrow as much as they need to borrow. And thankfully, the European Union has relaxed those fiscal rules. They've been suspended, and governments are basically being allowed and encouraged indeed to do what they need to do to try and get their economies back on track. So there's a lot of official support being given. More will be necessary over the coming months, and indeed, I think it will come. So, you know, in a nutshell, I do believe we've seen a much, much better global response to this crisis than we saw back in 2007, 2008. I will just reiterate I think a key point in all of this, people may feel ideologically uncomfortable with government stepping in and literally handing over money to households and to businesses, particularly businesses. But the reality is, when you think about it, there were thousands of businesses out there around, or millions of businesses that were very viable early March. Suddenly, through no fault of their own, they were forced to cease trading because of COVID-19 in the interests of public health. Um, Millions of workers around the world were laid off as a consequence of that. So to me, the imperative from the beginning, and I think I spoke about this back on March 23rd, to me, the imperative was to make sure that at the end of this, that as many businesses as possible that were forced to shut down are able to open up again. And that's why they needed to fill that liquidity problem that businesses had because of the collapse in revenue that occurred. So it was really important, in my view, to make sure that businesses, or as many as possible, would be in a position to reopen and would be in a position to re-employ all of those workers that were let go at the beginning of the crisis. The second part that's essential is that once businesses do open up, business conditions are going to be much more challenging for the next 12, 18 months. There's little doubt about that. For the vast majority of businesses, that's the case, because customers will be restricted because of social distancing requirements. Businesses will have to incur a lot of higher costs because of the various health protocols that have been put in place. There is the probability that global economic activity is going to be much more subdued, so business is just going to be weaker. So for a variety of reasons, it is essential that once businesses reopen, the support does not end there. Businesses will require a lot of tender, loving care and attention for the next 12, 18 months until turnover returns to normal levels. And if we're wrong, and if there's a strong economic recovery and if business turnover improves very quickly, well, then government will not provide that support. But while turnover is under pressure, I think it's essential that support is provided. I suppose all of this really flies in the face of sort of free market economics. But at a time like this, when you get a crisis like this, it is essential that government gets as involved as possible to make sure that we can get businesses, the economy, households back on track as quickly as possible. So where are we today? Well, obviously, when the shutdown happened to varying degrees in different countries, economic activity literally collapsed. And we will look back on the collapse in economic activity in a pretty unbelieving way in a couple of years' time when we look back on the collapse that actually happened. High frequency, and before we start to measure the magnitudes of the collapse, a lot of data is a little bit historical and backward looking. So what has actually happened over the last 3 months or so is that a lot of countries have started to look at high frequency data to get a clear picture of what's going on. And high frequency data would be stuff like measuring the movement of people based on their mobile phones, traffic volumes, stuff like that. Okay, so this is high frequency data. It's stuff you can measure on a day-to-day basis. And what the high frequency data showed us a couple of months ago at this stage was that economic activity had actually bottomed out and was starting to bounce back. We're now starting to get the lagged real economic data, and those real economic data are also showing significant signs of improvement. So I believe we will look back on that period, March, April, will represent the low point of the global economic cycle. And then the only question is, what sort of recovery we will see. The peak to trough decline in different countries has varied, and it has varied for two reasons. Number one, how different countries respond to COVID-19. So those countries that lock down very quickly, very aggressively, will typically suffer a much sharper peak to trough decline in economic activity. But on the other hand, the reason why some governments chose to adopt that path, and correctly in my view, is that it would set up for a stronger economic recovery once the virus was brought under control. The second thing that influences how badly affected an economy has been by this is basically the structure of the economy. So, for example, countries that are very dependent on tourism, car production, the retail and leisure sector, personal services, all of that stuff by definition was is high risk from a health perspective. So the most severe impacts have been felt in economies where those sectors were important. So you look at countries like Greece, for example, where tourism is incredibly important. The hit was really bad. Whereas countries that have a preponderance of IT, financial services, agri-food, pharma, the impact was smaller. If you look at then, going back to the question about the nature of the response in different countries, the Swedes adopted their own unique approach to this, which was basically revolved around a relatively light touch approach to controlling the virus, and much greater focus on trying to keep the economy open. Sweden was being lauded initially because of this approach, but over the last month or so, it has definitely gone pear-shaped, and the infection rate, the death rate has increased pretty dramatically. And, Sweden now has problems. The UK, Italy, Spain, we saw a much more severe economic impact. And then countries like Germany and the United States, from an economic perspective, are somewhere in the middle. So there's going to be very different impacts in different countries, depending on the response, depending on the sector breakdown of the economy, and also depending, of course, on how they open up their economies. And one of the things that is really concerning at the moment is, some economies are basically opening up too quickly, and we're starting to see secondary outbreaks. So it's there. Unfortunately, there's no science about this. It really, really is being driven by a virus that we still don't fully understand. So, and all of the risks that are associated with that. This is the US GDP story. You can see out there on the extreme right-hand side, the collapse in economic activity that occurred in the first quarter. I suspect the second quarter will probably be a little bit worse. This is the UK story. You can see out there on the right-hand side, the collapse in GDP. And I suppose what's worth looking at in all of these slides is the impact that the comparisons you can make with that period 2008, 2009, the great financial crash. And you can see there, the magnitude of the collapse has been was more significant in 2008, 2009. This is the euro area. You can see out there on the right hand side the collapse in activity. This is China. The first decline in economic activity, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, in about 3 decades. So pretty phenomenal stuff there. You can see Japan. Japan was already, the Japanese economy was already in trouble prior to COVID-19. And indeed, for those of you who listened in on the first webinar I did on the 23rd of March, I was really making the point that day that coming into COVID-19, the global economy was already pretty vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And Japan is one of those economies that stands out as being particularly vulnerable coming into this. Now, this is, I'm going to take you through a series of slides called the Purchasing Managers Index. The Purchasing Managers Index is basically a survey, okay, of manufacturing, and non-manufacturing or service activities, okay? It's conducted every month. It is a survey, lots of different questions, lots of different elements that is produced in a composite index, okay? And the way to interpret is, and I've drawn a red line to demonstrate, the way to interpret when the reading is above 50, it means that more businesses are expanding than contracting. When the reading is below 50, you can see that more businesses are contracting than expanding, okay? So that's how you interpret this. And you can see there the collapse that occurred in sort of March, April, very, very significant decline. This is US manufacturing, but you can also see there's been a pretty strong rebound over the last month or so. So US manufacturing is back in expansionary mode again. This is the services sector, the non-manufacturing sector. And no surprises here. You can see the collapse has been absolutely dramatic and the recovery to date has been a lot less dramatic. And the reason for that goes back to a point I made earlier, that services have been most adversely affected by this crisis because a lot of services like tourism, retail are very much dependent on human contact and as a consequence are relatively high risk, okay? So you can see service activities recovering a lot less strongly. This is the manufacturing index for the euro area. It is recovering, but is still below 50. One of the reasons for that is because car manufacturing is really important for economies like Germany, particularly, but France, Italy, Spain, and the car market was very badly hit by this crisis, but it is coming back. Sorry, that's the manufacturing. I see a typo here. This is non-manufacturing. This is the services sector. Sorry, the first one was non-manufacturing. This is non-manufacturing. This is, beg your pardon, this is the manufacturing one, okay? I spotted a typo, but you can see pretty much the same thing. Economic activity is still below that cutoff point in 50, but over the next couple of months, it will move back into expansionary territory. The prospects for recovery, what are they going to look like? Well, the global economy is being opened up on a gradual basis. That's good. As I've said, the policy backdrop continues to be very, very supportive. And as I said, will have to remain so for the next couple of years. Economic activity, cannot return to normal anytime soon. The next 12, 18 months are going to be different. And the reason why they're going to be different is because the virus will remain with us and physical distancing, health protocols, the fear of air travel, etc., will remain a feature of the landscape. And, but, having said that, when we get outbreaks from here on, I think it is inconceivable that we will actually have the same sort of lockdown that we saw mostly every place from March onwards. Okay, because I think economically that'll be impossible to achieve again. So that's why those countries that will do best will be those where testing, tracking, tracing, and isolation systems are most advanced. And TTTI is absolutely essential for the future control of this virus. Obviously, it may not be enough. Obviously we will get outbreaks, pockets of it, as we're now starting to see already. And when those happen, you will see a very localized response. You go in and you shut down an area or a sector. And I think that's what life is going to look like for the foreseeable future. Obviously, the risks to the economic recovery are very obvious, and it's a health issue rather than an economic issue. If we really got a dangerous second outbreak of the virus, well then, clearly the economic implications would be very, very difficult. And for students of history, if you go back and look at the Spanish flu, that Spanish flu erupted in the spring of 2018, a lot like what happened with COVID-19. And then during the summer to a greater extent with the Spanish flu than with COVID-19, but we saw the virus sort of dying off because, it was responsive to heat as well as everything else, which COVID-19 is not. But anyway, the Spanish flu was being brought under control. Then we had the ending of the First World War. We started to see soldiers returning from that war. In the case of the United States, I think it was Boston. I think it was November 1918. They had a victory celebration for the returning soldiers. I think a couple of 100,000 people at least gathered for this victory celebration. And that then unleashed the Spanish flu. And the second wave proved to be much, much more devastating from a health perspective, from an economic perspective than the first wave. So there are obvious lessons here from history. I would hope these days, with scientific advances, etc., that we're not going to get this serious outbreaks again. But, go back to the point the OECD made, the economic outlook is still extremely uncertain, and it is because of these health issues. This is what has happened. Oil prices, not surprisingly, from March onwards, as the global economy was shut down, oil prices absolutely collapsed, starting to come back now as economic activity starts to come back. So I would expect in the next 12 months, oil prices to come back towards their recent long-term average of around $60 to $70 per barrel. But at the moment, still below that level, but picking up as global economic activity picks up. For investors amongst you, this is an interesting one. This is what gold has done during this crisis. And you can see gold prices are now very, very close to record highs. And when you see a surge in gold prices like that in an upward direction, it means uncertainty, because gold still has safe haven status. And I suppose there's no other slide in this deck that tells this story more convincingly about just how nervous and uncertain the world is out there. And during periods like that, as we saw in 2009, 2010, gold tends to be a major beneficiary. This is the S&P 500, one of the US equity market indices. There's a couple of stories to be told here. From the first quarter of 2009 up to COVID-19, it had been an absolutely fantastic environment for long-term equity market investors. Then when COVID erupted, not surprisingly, in the 3 weeks or so up to the 22nd, 23rd of March, equity markets took a real hammering. But, and this is, I suppose the surprising bit, since the 22nd, 23rd of March in most countries, equity markets have rebounded very, very strongly. Why? Well, there's two reasons. One is the markets are anticipating economic recovery. And secondly, in an environment of zero official interest rates virtually everywhere and historically low bond yields, there's not much else to do with money at the moment. So a lot of investment funds by default are finding their way into equity markets. As an economist, I would feel deeply uncomfortable with that, because the economic fundamentals don't support that sort of equity market performance at the moment. But equity markets do tend to take a forward-looking view, and what they are currently telling us is they believe over the next 12, 18 months, there will be a strong global economic recovery. And as I've said, that is a prognosis that is obviously open to risk because of secondary outbreaks. The impact on global travel is, it's an interesting one. Okay, there's a lot of different factors at play here. Economic recession globally, always damages the willingness of people and the affordability of international travel for people. But I think there's a much bigger issue than the economic one, and that's the fact that international travel has become so much more difficult. Travel restrictions are being put in place, and we see those travel restrictions are being very heavily influenced by how well countries avoided or contained the virus. And it's interesting, the UK government has deemed Greece to be a country that is safe to travel to and people to travel from, whereas the Greeks have taken the opposite view about the UK. They believe that there should be travel restrictions on people entering Greece from the United Kingdom. So there's a lot of this sort of stuff going on at the moment, and you will see over the coming weeks, you know, countries will move to try and identify these sort of travel bubbles, countries between which it is safe to travel. And that will obviously be determined by how countries are deemed to be dealing with the crisis. Travelers from high-risk airports will face significant restrictions. So the nature of travel will be testing, self-isolation, quarantining for 14 days in some cases, including Ireland at the moment. You will have supervised quarantine, you'll have travel bubbles, you'll have travel corridors. So, you know, the bottom line is that global travel for the foreseeable future is going to be really, really discommoded. And for countries that are very heavily dependent on tourism, that is obviously a serious challenge. I just get a little bit parochial here. Ryanair took to the skies on the 1st of July. It has 40% capacity for July. They expect that to rise to 60% in August. So, you know, we're starting to see it coming back. But, you know, apart from the official restrictions in place, rebuilding consumer confidence, making them feel safe to travel in planes again, is obviously going to be challenging. This is the OECD's Global Economic Outlook, and it was an unusual outlook. It was the end of June, in that they gave two scenarios, and we're not talking about cocktails here. The single hit scenario is one where, you know, you get the outbreak in March, April, and then restrictions are lifted successfully and economic activity rebounds quite strongly. Whereas the second hit scenario, or the double hit scenario, is where you get a serious secondary outbreak of the virus, in which case the economic outlook for 2021 is a lot less reassuring. And that this really highlights more than anything else the point I was making about the OECD is just says there's just so much health related uncertainty out there at the moment that it is really difficult to be in the least definitive about what the global economy is going to look like over the next 12, 18 months. The risks to recovery, I've covered most of these, you know, secondary outbreaks, you know, how those outbreaks will be dealt with. The good thing is that we do understand more about the virus and how to contain it today than we did back in March. But inevitably, trade and investment restrictions, you know, are in place. We're seeing restrictions on the movement of people. And when I lectured you last year, I would have spoken about one of the threats to the global economy was this increased move towards protectionism. You know, Brexit, the rise of Donald Trump, etc., Orban in Hungary, all of that stuff was a sort of an anti-free trade and anti-globalization. And the OECD, I think, summed it up very well by saying that we're now in danger globally of moving from the great integration, which is the globalization project, to the great fragmentation, where we're going to see more and more barriers to the free movement of goods, people, services growing up around the world. And COVID-19 has definitely exacerbated that situation. I mentioned earlier that this crisis is and will exacerbate inequality, with young and lower skilled workers worst affected. Trump is politically, at least, in a spot of bother at the moment. Joe Biden is well ahead in the polls, in most polls. So the risk here would be, you know, what might Donald Trump do ahead of the November election to try and close that gap with Biden? I shudder to think what's possible in that regard. But clearly, a lot of his focus at the moment is on rejuvenating the spat he's had with China over the last few years. Peace broke out in January and February, but definitely Trump is upping the ante against China at the moment. So whatever Trump does over the coming months will all be driven by the opinion polls and nothing else. So you'd have to be a little bit concerned. As I say earlier, it is vital that a debt crisis is not allowed evolve, leading to fragility in the banking system. So that's why supporting households, supporting business debt is really important. Brexit has not gone away. It seems very clear that, well, certain that Britain is going to leave the transition mechanism on the 31st of December, regardless of whether a deal is done with the European Union or not, a trade deal. My gut instinct, for what it's worth, and will probably be proven to be wrong again, is that a deal will be done. It will be a watered down deal, but a deal will be done, and that Britain will avoid entering a WTO trading regime after the 1st of January. But that's a high risk scenario still. And my gut instinct is certainly not enough for business planning purposes. So I think all businesses with UK exposure need to think about and really focus in now on the possibility that Britain will crash out next January and the WTO regime would apply. We hope for the best, but we've got to plan for the worst case scenario. So a lot of uncertainty out there. The Irish thing, going to wrap it up very quickly because it's very similar to, you know, that global picture. Dramatic decline in activity. The economy is now being opened up. Our new government is going to have to borrow a lot of money over the next couple of years. I don't have a problem with that. There is no choice. We've got to accept higher deficits. But what I do believe is very definitely the case is that fiscal austerity cannot follow this. We cannot turn around and start increasing taxes and cutting spending as we did back after 2007, 2008 to get the public finances back in order, because that would risk, austerity would risk turning a recession into a depression. So, and while I say this for Ireland, I think it's true of every country. For the next couple of years, accept higher deficits because they are necessary to get economies back on track. So the recovery issues for Ireland, you know, it's very similar to the global story. So I won't elaborate on, because I'm coming up against the clock at this stage. I want to take a few questions if there are any out there. One point I would make, that I did make, is that very definitely Brexit still poses a major threat to Ireland, and it's one Irish businesses need to continue to focus in on. So finally, you know, the long-term impact of this, there will be a massive government debt legacy around the world. Social distancing protocols will apply until a vaccine is successfully and safely delivered. The growth of economic nationalism, tighter borders restrictions, that sort of what I described earlier, the OECD described at least as the great integration moving to the great fragmentation. The migration to online, you know, has significant implications for the retail sector, and definitely those retailers with a strong online presence are those that have done best during this crisis. So there is a business lesson to be learned there. Remote working will become an increasing feature of the workplace for some, but not for the majority. You know, I think the vast majority of people, they really do want to get back into the social confines of a working space, an office, as quickly as possible. For some, remote working will really suit, but for many, you know, so in other words, the point I'm trying to make is that this is not the end of commercial property. There will still be a demand for office working, but more flexibility built in. I've said and I repeat, it's essential to prevent an economic crisis from morphing into a banking crisis. Re-employing workers is absolutely vital. Okay, I've spoken for way too long. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
We have one question from Michael Donahoe. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself and ask
Yeah.
your question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Very informative again. Thank you. What's the outlook, do you think, with all this uncertainty for the housing market, given where we've come from in Ireland? What's going to happen in the next, say, 12, 24 months, in your view?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. A really good question that I conveniently overlooked. Okay. If you look at the sort of fundamentals that drive demand for housing at a point in time, okay, there's obviously demographics, but there's structural stuff that drives demand for housing, but there's also economic fundamental stuff, you know, unemployment, earnings growth, consumer confidence. And when the economy collapsed there in March, all of those things collapsed. You know, unemployment went up to over 28% of the labor force. It's coming back down to 22 at the moment, but still a lot of people unemployed. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. You would have thought, well, certainly I would have thought that we could see a decline of up to 10% in house prices over the next 12 months. Okay, and that was my sort of call earlier in this. The evidence to date isn't really supporting that. Okay, there are not too many transactions happening, but prices seem to be holding up. They're softening, but they're holding up reasonably well. But I still think there's a bit of a distance to go. You know, I would expect some decline in house prices this year. But if you look forward to 2021, strong population growth, falling household size here, increased employment, all of the structural forces will, and sorry, the most important one of all is that we still have a fundamental demand-supply imbalance in the market. And that is going to be exacerbated this year because we're going to build a lot less houses this year than we should be building. So I would think from 2021 onwards that house prices will start to rise again. So nutshell, 2020, I would expect to see some setback in prices. Probably not the 10% I would have believed possible in March, but certainly some setback would appear sensible. But 21 onwards, you will see that demand coming back into the market, not enough supply, prices likely to rise, not aggressively as we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years. But I'll just sum it up in one final point. We should be building probably, depending on who you listen to, 35 to 40,000 houses per annum in this country. This year, we're going to build around 14,000. Without COVID, we would have built around 24, 25,000 this year, still well below what's required. So there is a fundamental imbalance in the market.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
We also have a question from Martin.
Hi, Martin.
Martin, you still there?
Yeah. Hey, Jim. Yeah, just looking at the QE that you described earlier and where the money's actually going, it seems to be giving frothy S&P numbers, but not any real benefit to the 90% of the populace who aren't so bothered by that. Are you surprised that they haven't been more inventive and creative with how they're spending the newly created money?
Well, QE, you know, I would argue actually that the 90% of people are benefiting from QE, because what QE is facilitating is the maintenance of historically low bond yields. Because without historically low bond yields, the ability of governments to borrow the sort of money that they are borrowing to pump into households at the moment and to support businesses would not be possible. So if you didn't have QE in the background, bond yields would be significantly higher, and that would limit significantly the amount of money, the level of deficit that countries, governments could engage in. So that is the purpose of QE at the moment, Martin. It is to keep bond yields down, full stop. And I think that is operating successfully at the moment because it is facilitating more affordable borrowing by governments. Because, you know, at the end of the day, The key way in which households and businesses are being helped here is through fiscal policy, and monetary policy, as in QE, is facilitating that, in my view.
Cool, thanks.
Anything else out there?
Hi, Jim. It's Daniel here. I'll just talk instead of typing and having to talk again. My question for you is quite a simplistic one, really. Well, I think it is, anyways. But for the next 12 to 18 months, as you describe, and you hear lots of people mentioning that a lot of businesses will struggle. We won't be back to like max output, but can a lot of these smaller businesses or medium-sized smaller businesses survive operating on even 90%? Are they able to survive? Because realistically, they won't be able to operate any higher, really, will they?
Well, I think, Daniel, it's quite simple, to be honest. For the next 12, 18 months, depending on the type of business, but the ones that are most exposed to this, they will be operating at significantly lower levels of turnover, okay? They will be facing virtually the same costs of doing business. So a lot of those businesses without strong official support will not be viable. But policymakers have then got to step in and say, and it's businesses in the tourism sector, really, hotels, restaurants, pubs, they are the ones that are most vulnerable to this, okay? And indeed, non-grocery retailers. But the point is that we've a choice to make here. If you do not support those businesses through grants, and I mean literal grants, those businesses will go out of business. You will end up with permanently higher unemployment. You will end up with streets of our villages, cities, towns being seriously damaged by the closure of these businesses. And, ultimately, without pubs, restaurants, hotels, it will not be possible to rebuild the tourism sector once international travel resumes, probably in 2022. So that's the choice that has to be made at the moment. I have done a lot of work with the Restaurants Association over the last 3 or 4 months, and genuinely, and this isn't sort of fear mongering, but that we would reckon that at least 50% of restaurants will not survive without strong official support. Okay, and that's the choice that has to be made. Do you want these businesses to survive or not? There is always this problem when you're stepping into subsidized business that this dead weight loss, or whatever you call it, it's not quite a dead weight loss, but you end up supporting businesses that were never going to survive anyway. But listen, in a crisis situation like this, you are always going to make mistakes. I think there has to be a strong imperative to support businesses to the greatest extent possible. And as their turnover gradually recovers, which you hope it will over the next 18 months, that level of support will be gradually reduced for different sectors of the economy. But for SMEs, it's a bloody tough environment at the moment. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, that's perfect, Jim. I have one further question if no one else has one, Jim.
Okay.
What is your view on the German government supporting Lufthansa and Mr. Michael O'Leary's views on that in terms of the free market? Is it fair?
I'm with Michael O'Leary on this, I have to say, unambiguously. I think it is grossly unfair that, Ryanair competes with Lufthansa on many European routes, okay? And if you are, as a private company, competing with a company that's been heavily subsidized by government, there is a serious problem. So I think it's being charitable about it. It's grossly unfair. But from a legal perspective, I just can't see how it possibly stands up. So but I can also see from the German government's perspective why it would step in to support Lufthansa, because it wants a national airline. It'd be a massive loss to Germany. But at an EU level, a decision has to be made then. Well, if you're going to support Lufthansa, you've got to support Ryanair as well. So there's a serious competition issue here.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim. It's Simon here.
Hi, Simon.
I've just got a question on the bond market. If the bond yields for Ireland are at about zero at the minute, why doesn't the country just kind of borrow as much as possible now and allow inflation erode the deficit over the coming decade or so?
Well, I think you'll find that the Irish government this year and next year will borrow very aggressively. You know, we could be borrowing 25 billion this year, you know, and that's bloody aggressive stuff. It really is. Is there a limit to how much the government can borrow? Well, there is a limit, to be honest, because, you know, if the more you borrow, the more vulnerable you become to a loss of international confidence. And back in 10-11, when Ireland's ability to borrow money seriously deteriorated because international investors lost confidence in us, you know, Ireland was thrown into a serious crisis that was only rescued by the hated Troika. So when you are borrowing aggressively on international markets, there is always a vulnerability there for a country. And that's why, you know, there has to be logically some limit to the amount that countries can borrow. And it's very difficult to be sort of scientific and precise about what that limit is. But I suspect, you know, if the Irish government decided to borrow 50 billion this year, which you could easily do, given the state of the economy at the moment. But if it did borrow, I feel that would be a step too far. And I think international investors would then start to seriously question Ireland's ability to ever sustain that level of debt. So that there has to be a lot of borrowing, but there also has to be a limit on that borrowing. And that's why that borrowing needs to be used as effectively and efficiently as possible to get the economy back on track as quickly as possible, because the only sure way of eventually getting rid of this deficit is through economic growth, not through austerity. Because as economies grow, you get this automatic stabilization effect where tax revenues start to pick up, government starts to spend less money on unemployment benefits and so on. So there is a limit in a nutshell, and I prefer not to test what that limit is. If we can get away with borrowing around 25 billion this year, that'd be good. Bit less next year.
Perfect, thanks. And can I just follow up and just ask if we had burned the bondholders back in 2009 or whenever that was, 2010, what kind of, I know it's very hypothetical, but what kind of position do you think we would be in now?
Actually, I don't think it's hypothetical at all, to be honest. I really believe, and I was totally against burning the bondholders at the time. And I think if we had done, it would have provided short-term populist relief, but the long-term consequence would be that the next time you have a crisis, your whole world is very different. So if we had defaulted on debt back then, I think our ability to borrow money at the moment would be seriously constrained.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, there's a comment here that Iceland is back and it did burn bondholders. Well, you know, Iceland is a very different economy than Ireland. Ireland is part of the European Union. You know, we're a much more internationalized economy than Iceland. So the more internationalized you are as an economy, the more globalized you are, the more vulnerable you would be. I would pose the question, take a look at Argentina over the last few years. The Argentinians burned the bondholders twice, and look where Argentina still is. You know, Iceland was a kind of a unique economy, kind of a unique case, but I don't think what happened in Iceland could have worked for Ireland, not least because we're a member of the European Union. Okay, folks, will I wrap it there?
We do have one last question if you want to.
Yes, fine, Catherine. Yeah.
No, it's fine. You can leave, Catherine. Thank you very much, Jim.
Okay, folks, thank you very much indeed. The very best of luck with the remainder of your studies in Smurfit. I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.